The snow came early that year. By late October it had already buried the dry grasses and choked the creek bed, silencing the earth with its cold hand. A gray wind came down off the bluff, sliding like a knife through cottonwood trees stripped bare and rattling against the sides of the sagging cabin. The boards in the porch steps had splintered. The door hung crooked in its frame. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. She stood at the edge of the field, wrapped in a frayed shawl, her boots swallowed by the snow. The hem of her dress was soaked through, and the frost had settled in her hair like ash. Her arms ached from carrying too much for too long. Her lungs burned with the bite of the cold. Behind her, the land stretched wide and white and silent, indifferent to the woman shaking in its midst. Her fingers clenched the handle of the wagon. Inside, tucked beneath every threadbare quilt she had left, her 4 children lay still. The youngest had not cried since yesterday. The oldest, only 11, had tried to be brave, but had looked at her with eyes full of doubt. She had no more words for them, no more promises. Only west. That was all she knew. There was a town 3 days' ride across the low hills if the snow didn't rise too high. She would not wait for the landlord's man to come again with his smug voice and a sheriff behind him. She would not kneel in that kitchen another winter waiting for scraps of kindness that never came. She did not leave a note. She did not look back at the house when she stepped off the porch for the last time. It had not been a home. Not truly. Not since the day he left 4 years gone now, with a prayer on his lips and another woman's name tucked in his coat. The wind picked up. Her shawl lifted at the edges. One child coughed. She pulled it tighter and forced one foot in front of the other, boots crunching over ice-hardened snow. By nightfall they were 2 miles out at the edge of the old burnt grove. The stumps stood black against the snow, a graveyard of trees once taken by lightning. She built a fire from what she could find, damp wood and dried grass, nothing more. It hissed and fought her, but it burned. She fed the children cold beans and sang to them in a voice she no longer recognized. Her eyes stung from smoke and weariness. When they slept, she did not. Her hands trembled and her breath came in fits. A fox cried out in the hills and was answered by silence. Morning came without sunlight. She tied rags around the children's feet and set out again. Her legs ached. Her back throbbed with every step. She could not feel her toes. Snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, like a warning whispered in a dead man's voice. By the second day the horse faltered. Its breath came ragged and white. She stopped only long enough to pour melted snow into a tin cup and press it to the cracked lips of each child. Her own thirst clawed at her throat, but she did not drink. At dusk they reached the old cattle road. It was barely a track now, swallowed by drifts and shadowed by a ridge to the east. She saw a barn there, barely standing, half its roof gone, but it meant shelter. She dragged the wagon off the path and pulled it as close to the structure as she could. She was trying to unhitch the horse when she heard hooves. Not her own. She turned sharply, breath caught halfway to her lungs. He sat atop a roan gelding, broad-shouldered and wrapped in a dark coat, his hat rimmed in snow. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her. Looked at the wagon, at the children's shapes barely visible beneath the quilts. Her heart stuttered. Her hands balled into fists. "Don't come near," she said. He nodded once. Didn't move. "I don't want trouble." "I reckon not," he said. The wind gusted, scattering snow between them. "You aiming to spend the night in that barn?" he asked after a long pause. She didn't answer. "You won't last," he said, quiet but clear. "Not in this cold. Not with young ones." She turned away from him, back toward the wagon, shoulders drawn tight. "We'll manage." He was silent. She waited for him to leave. But he didn't. Not until she tried to haul the horse forward again and failed, her knees buckling beneath her. She fell hard, her hands sinking into the snow, pain flashing up her arms. That's when he spoke again. 5 words. "Let me help you, ma'am." She didn't answer, just stayed there in the snow on her hands and knees, shoulders shaking from more than the cold. Her hair hung loose around her face, clinging to her cheeks where tears should been but weren't. She'd already run out of those. The horse shifted beside her, uneasy. He dismounted without hurry, boots crunching as he crossed the space between them. He didn't offer a hand, just stood near enough to be heard over the wind, far enough to be safe. "I ain't looking to take anything," he said, "and I sure as hell ain't looking to tell you what to do." Still no answer. "I've got a house down past that rise. Wood stove's going. Plenty of room." She turned her face just enough to see him. Snow clung to his collar. His eyes were steady and lined, but not hard. He looked like a man who'd worked too many winters alone. "Why?" she asked. It was a small voice. Not suspicious, just exhausted. He squinted out at the land. "Don't rightly know. Guess I don't much like watching people freeze to death." She let out a long breath, almost a laugh, but it caught in her throat and stayed there. One of the children stirred in the wagon, mumbling something in a sleep-fogged voice. She looked back at them, then at the barn barely standing, then back to him. "I've got 4. He nodded. "I saw. You have food." "I do. A stove. Wood enough for 2 weeks more if I cut tomorrow." Another pause. She looked down at her numb hands, the blood crusting on her knuckles where she'd split the skin. Then back to him. "You touch them, I'll kill you. I believe that." She stood, slowly. Every joint protested, her body stiff with cold and burden. "All right," she said. He turned without a word and walked to her horse, speaking softly as he took the reins. His gentleness with the animal caught her off guard. She lifted the eldest child, first pressing a kiss to her brow before passing her over. The man carried her like she weighed nothing, tucking her into the crook of his arm. It took 4 trips. He tied their wagon behind his and helped her into the saddle last. The ride was silent, save for the wind and the creak of leather. She held the smallest in her arms, head against her chest. He rode beside her, not too close, not too far. His cabin was tucked into the trees at the base of a ridge, half hidden behind drifts and bare-limbed ash. Smoke lifted straight into the night sky, clean and blue. The windows glowed like lanterns. Inside it smelled of pine and old tobacco and something warm on the stove. He lit a second lamp, setting it low. "Water's warm in the kettle. You can wash up if you like." She nodded, too tired to speak. There was a pallet already laid out near the hearth. He brought over quilts, more than she expected, and she laid the children down in a line, smoothing hair, checking fingers and toes. All there, all warm. For now. He poured water into a basin and stepped away. She scrubbed her hands, then her face, then drank 2 full cups before stopping. He didn't ask questions. Didn't ask where her husband was or what drove her into the snow with 4 mouths to feed. Didn't ask her name. He simply tended the fire and sliced bread onto tin plates and left them on the table like it was all the most natural thing in the world. When the children were asleep and her stomach was full, she sat near the fire with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, staring at the flames. He sat across the room, fixing a broken buckle on a saddle strap, the silence between them steady and honest. After a long while, she looked up at him. "You live out here alone?" "Most days." "No wife?" "No more." She didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer. Instead, he said, "You can stay as long as you need. No strings." She stared at him a moment. "You don't even know my name." He looked up, then real slow, eyes calm. "Ma'am," he said, "you just walk through snow with 4 children and no place to sleep. You think your name's the first thing I need to know." She smiled, just barely. Then for the first time in a long time, She let herself lean back, the warmth of the fire on her face, her body still aching, but not afraid. Don't turn back now. Subscribe and follow the trail deeper into the west. The days passed slow and clean. She woke before the children always and stepped outside to the stillness. The snow had stopped, but the cold held. Crisp air filled her lungs like ice, and each breath steadied her a little more than the one before. A grove of ash trees bordered the back of the cabin, their limbs black and reaching skeletons etched against the pale dawn sky. He was usually already up splitting wood in the yard with the same quiet precision he did everything else. He never offered to teach her, just left the axe where she could find it and let her decide. She took it on the third day. Blisters came fast. Her palms stung every time the wood cracked beneath the blade, but she welcomed the pain. It reminded her she was still here, still trying. The children grew color in their cheeks again. They played in the snow outside the cabin, built crooked forts, and chased one another with stick swords. At night he read from an old book by lantern light, his voice low and steady while she stitched torn hems and listened from the corner. She learned small things about him in those days. He'd come from Wyoming. Raised cattle, once lost most of them to drought. He didn't say much about what had come after, only that the land here was quieter, that he liked the quiet. One evening, after the children were in bed, she sat on the steps with her shawl wrapped tight and asked, "Why do you live like this?" He was feeding the horses. He didn't answer right away. "After I buried her," he said finally, "I couldn't make sense of folks anymore. Felt like every room was too full. So I came out here. Never thought much past that." "You don't get lonely?" He shrugged. "You get used to your own company, though I reckon it's been good having the noise again." She smiled at that. It was true. The place felt warmer now, full of life, even if it was just small things, laughter, soup simmering on the stove boots left by the door. She caught him watching the children sometimes. Not with sadness, more like a man remembering something he'd thought was gone. He was careful with them, quiet but present. He fixed the broken hinge on the toy box the youngest wouldn't let go of. He built a stool for the eldest to stand on when she helped wash dishes. He taught the boy how to tie knots, and he never once stepped in where he wasn't needed. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry out to freeze, the boy came running to her, eyes wide. "He let me ride his horse," he said, "alone." She glanced toward the field. The man was leaning against the fence, arms crossed, watching with the barest hint of a smile. That night, when the children were asleep and the fire burned low, she sat by the window mending a sleeve. He was whittling something at the table, quiet as always. "I still don't know your name," she said. He looked up, surprised. "You never asked?" She set the needle down. "All right. What is it?" "Elias." She nodded. "Mine's Ruth." He nodded back. "Good name." They sat like that for a while, the silence no longer empty. Later that week, a storm moved in from the west. Snow piled high, and the wind screamed through the gaps in the window frames. Elias nailed up extra boards, stuffed rags in the cracks, and brought in more firewood. They stayed close to the hearth, the children restless, the cabin tighter than usual. By the third night, Ruth stood near the stove, holding the smallest child who'd woken crying from a dream. Her arms were tired, her back stiff. The child wouldn't settle. Elias reached for the kettle and poured warm water into a cup, added a pinch of something from a small tin. "Try this," he said, offering it. She took it, letting the steam rise to the child's face. Slowly the crying eased. The little one curled into her shoulder and fell asleep. She looked at Elias. "Thank you." He just nodded. Something shifted then. Not loud, not sudden, but real. He didn't reach for her, didn't cross the room. but he stayed beside her as the fire cracked and the wind howled as if to say, "I'm here if you want me to be." The thaw came slow. By mid-December, the snow began to slump from the branches, dripping into the soft hush of morning. The children ran outside in boots too big, splashing through slush, their laughter echoing against the hills. Ruth watched them from the porch, arms crossed, shawl pulled tight. The wind still had teeth, but it no longer cut straight through. Inside, she swept the floor, scrubbed the pans, taught the girls to braid. She found satisfaction in the rhythm of small things. The cabin, once strange and silent, now smelled of bread smoke and wool. Her hands grew steady again, her eyes brighter. She laughed, sometimes quiet and unsure, but it was there. Elias gave her space, but never absence. He'd return from the hills with game slung over his shoulder or a bundle of pine for the fire. He never came in loud, never demanded. Just stepped into the warmth, stamped snow from his boots, and asked if she'd eaten. He built a sled from scrap wood and rope, hauled the children across the field until his breath came ragged and they begged for one more turn. Ruth watched, arms folded, a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. One evening she found him in the shed behind the cabin, bent over a workbench shaving cedar. "What are you making?" He glanced up, surprised. "Handles for kitchen tools. Yours are about to give out." She stepped closer. The shed was cramped, warmed by a single oil lamp. Tools lined the walls in careful order. His hands moved slow, precise, shaping the wood without waste. "You don't talk much," he said. "No. You think a lot." "I do." She watched the curl of shavings fall to the floor. "You're kind," she said, and her voice nearly broke on it. "Not just decent. Kind." He didn't look up, just kept his hands moving. "You've had a hard run. I've seen it before. Not like this." Now he did meet her eyes. "No," he said, "not like this." The moment held, heavy with all the words they hadn't said. The storm they both knew was still out there waiting. That night, Ruth woke before dawn to the sound of hooves on packed earth. She went to the window and saw the shape of a man dismounting in the dark. Not Elias. The knock came slow, like a habit. She opened the door half an inch and saw a face she hadn't seen in years. Samuel. He looked older, thinner, but the tilt of his mouth hadn't changed. He smelled of travel and smoke and the old charm that had fooled her once. "I heard you were out this way," he said. Didn't believe it at first. She stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. "You need to go." "I'm your husband, Ruth." "You left." "I came back." "Why?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Don't want my kids growing up without knowing their father." She shook her head. "You didn't want them when we had a roof? When they cried for you? When we starved? I made mistakes. I'm trying to fix them. Go home, Samuel." "I am home. You're my wife." "I was," she said. "Not anymore." The door creaked behind her. Elias stepped out, silent, rifle resting loosely in one hand. He didn't raise it, didn't threaten, just stood. Samuel's eyes flicked to him, then back to her. "This what you're doing now?" he asked. "Living off some backwoods cowboy?" Ruth took a breath. The frost stung her throat, but her spine stayed straight. "I'm living, Samuel. That's more than you ever gave me." He looked at her a long time. Then he spat in the snow and walked back to his horse. "You'll regret this." She didn't answer. He rode off. When she turned, Elias was still there, quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." She looked down. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but something deeper. Old rage. Old hurt. Pushed down so long it burned on its way back up. He reached out slow and placed one hand over hers. Warm, solid. "You're safe now," he said. "I don't want to just be safe. I know." She looked up at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I want to belong." He nodded, and his voice was steady as ever. "You do." Winter passed, not in a burst but in slow, surrendering inches. Snow gave way to mud, the wind lost its bite, and the creek behind the ridge began to run again. The children shed their coats, their boots caked now with soil instead of frost. Wild geese passed overhead in a crooked line, and with them came something like hope. Ruth stood barefoot on the porch one morning, the boards warming beneath her feet, a baby on her hip and sunlight in her eyes. The child reached for her necklace, a simple wooden cross on a leather cord, and tugged gently. She smiled and pressed the baby's hand to her chest. Inside, Elias was laughing. The sound had come slow to him, rusted like an old hinge that needed time, but now it lived in him easy. He held the youngest boy upside down by the ankles, spinning slow circles while the others squealed and shouted around them. They weren't his, not by blood, but you wouldn't know it. He taught them to ride, to read sign in the dirt, to listen for a storm in the silence. He gave them chores and stories, quiet pride when they got it right, patience when they didn't. Ruth watched it all like a woman who'd been walking blind for miles and finally saw a lantern light. One evening, just before supper, she found Elias in the garden behind the house, crouched low, running his fingers through the early shoots. "You always plant this early?" she asked. He looked up. "No, never had reason to before." She knelt beside him. Her skirt caught on a weed, tore slightly, but she didn't care. She touched the small green leaves poking through the soil. "These'll come in strong." He nodded. "Might have more mouths to feed by fall." There was a pause. Not sharp, just full. Then he said, "You thought about staying?" She looked up. "I mean past spring," he said. "Past thaw. Here, with me." Her breath caught, not because she hadn't thought about it, but because she had 100 times. And every time the same answer had taken root in her chest like something she'd never dared name. "Yes," she said. "I have." He looked at her like a man who didn't want to move too fast and risk breaking something holy. "You sure?" "I am." He stood then, wiped his hands on his trousers, fished something from his coat pocket. Not gold, not even silver. Just a ring carved from wood, smooth and dark, worn at the edges. "My father made this," he said, "for my mother. He didn't have coins, so he used what he had." He held it out. "I got coin now. Could buy you better. But I figured this had weight. If you wanted it." Ruth didn't speak, just held out her hand and let him place it on her finger. It fit. Not perfectly, but true. She felt the warmth of it settle into her like the first fire after a storm. That night, after the children had gone to bed, they stood by the window watching the wind stir through the grass. Lamps dim. House still. "We'll build more rooms," Elias said. "One for each of them, and another out back for work. You could take in mending if you wanted." She nodded. He looked down. "I want you to know I'm not trying to fix what broke. That's yours to carry." "I know. I just want to be what comes after." "You already are." In the dark, her fingers found his. Not desperate. Not unsure. Just right. Spring came. With it the garden bloomed. The children's hands stained green. The days stretched long and golden. At night they ate around the table by lamplight, soft voices rising and falling, the sound of belonging thick in the air. The house grew fuller but never crowded. Ruth's laughter joined the creak of the porch swing. Elias's boots settled at the doorway next to 4 pairs of smaller ones. And in a small wooden box by the hearth she kept the shawl she'd worn that winter, torn, threadbare, still smelling faintly of smoke and snow. Not as a relic, but a reminder. of how far they'd come. The horizon is wide, subscribe and see what waits beyond it.